Hi everyone, welcome back to the Stitches and Scribbles channel. My name is Erin and I've got another What I Read in a Month episode for you today. I do apologize if you can hear my air conditioning in the background. It is quite hot today on the day that I'm filming this and I am not going to turn it off for the video. I'm already planning on spending most of the day down here in the basement. I guess it's not actually that it's that hot because it's like right over a little above 80 degrees today, but it's so humid out because of rain that we're supposed to have, and it rained last night, so we just seem to be stuck in this pattern of like it's not actually that hot, but like it could rain at any second. We had that for a little bit last week, and then it looks like this week is going to be the same, so lots of moisture in the air. That means lots of mosquitoes at night, which is also not ideal. And just a lot of weird weather things going on. I do apologize that this episode is coming out a little bit late from what my normal schedule is. Normally I upload every Saturday, and this is probably going to come out like the following Tuesday or even Wednesday from when it was supposed to be out. Just because I was fighting a cold last week, and then that kind of bled into 4th of July celebrations that ran a little longer than expected. So I decided to just let myself have a break, especially because I was really wiped out after 4th of July stuff. So I let myself have the weekend to rest and relax instead of worrying about getting a video up on time, knowing that I had plenty of time to do it this week. So that's why this video is coming out after the July 4th weekend. I just did not have the time or the voice to film when I was supposed to on my plan. But with all that being said, it's time to dive into what I read in June of 2024, and I did do quite a lot of reading this month. The school year ended, so I suddenly had some more free time. I also was really making it a goal to try to get through my physical TBR this summer. Well, at least a portion of my physical TBR. I am very much a mood reader, and I would say in the last couple of years I've noticed that I'm even a like seasonal reader. I like it when my books match the season we're in, if that's relevant to the story at all. So the way I decided to manage my physical TBR was pulling out all of the books that kind of had a summery vibe to them, and I left the summery vibe like pretty loose. That could mean like beachy rom-coms, it meant fantasy that involved like mermaids, pirate ships, stuff like that, nonfiction that had any sort of like aquatic theme, and there was another kind of weird vibe. Oh, I had a couple of like thriller, true crime type things that had a very like summery placement to them, so I included those as well. So this is only our first month of tackling the summer TBR, so I'll probably have more things in that category coming up. But I then separated the rest of my physical TBR into fall, winter, and spring books, using kind of the same methods. A lot of my fall picks were very like traditional thrillers, horror, mystery, anything that specifically had a fall setting, anything that was like kind of cozy or had to deal with like harvests or farms or like stuff like that. My winter ones, if it had snow on the cover, it was a given. I had quite a few snowy books. I have a couple books coming up that have like Christmas themes in them, including a horror fantasy retelling of the Nutcracker that I happened to find in a little library. So we'll definitely talk about that one when it gets closer to the holiday season. And then my spring books, I think I put a lot of like wedding books in there, or things with like lighter themes to them. So yeah, I just made the decision to split up my physical TBR into those categories because I knew I'd be more motivated to read things if it felt like it was the right time to read them. So with all that explanation out of the way, let's dive into what I actually read. The first book on my list, it was on my physical TBR, but I don't have the physical copy because I lent it to someone to borrow. But it's called The Coincidence of Coconut Cake by Amy E. Reichert. Looks like this. I picked this up in a little library, I think at this point, at least a year ago, if not like 2 years ago. because it took place in Milwaukee. So, and when I saw the cover, I thought it was going to be just kind of like a cozy rom-com, but it is a very summery book. A lot of the plot takes place over the summer in the Milwaukee area, and if you're from the Milwaukee area, you'll notice a lot of familiar sights and celebrations. There's a whole day in the book that takes place at Summerfest. There's a day that takes place at State Fair. Our couple ends up dancing in the rain at Irish Fest, like very stereotypical Milwaukee stuff going on. But this plot ended up being very satisfying to read because it was the right level of being angry at the characters for the decisions that they were making, but it like all worked out in the end. So our main character, her name is Lou. She is a restaurateur in Milwaukee. She's a head chef, owns her own restaurant, and ends up receiving a bad review that really puts her restaurant in trouble. She thinks she's not going to be able to stay open. A lot of people were waiting for this review, and it turned out really, really bad because of some other stuff that she was dealing with that day. She then meets a man named Al, who she falls in love with quickly and decides to show him like all the stuff in Milwaukee, which is why they go on all these excursions to see things, specifically anything food related. What Lou doesn't know is that Al is actually the person who wrote the review, and Al slowly figures this out over time as well, not connecting Lou's name with the name of her restaurant, because Lou is a nickname. So it's very intense in that you are reading a lot of the story knowing that eventually Lou is going to figure out what Al did, and Al is just trying his best to soften the blow, undo what he did, like try to rectify the situation without telling her. But it's a really cute, very like satisfying rom-com, and I would say like if you're not familiar with the Milwaukee area, it's not like that key to the story, but if you are, it adds so much to the atmosphere. Everything felt like very familiar because of that. So I highly recommend this book. I actually then went to Half Price Books and purchased all 3 of the other books this author has written, which also all take place, if not in Milwaukee, then in Wisconsin. And I have one or two of hers picked out for my continuing summer TBR, and then I have another one set aside for fall because it has to do with making apple cider, so I figured that was a good fall one. But they all seem to have food related themes and Wisconsin related themes in them, so highly, highly recommend. I loved this book so much. It was definitely a 5-star read. The next one that I read is Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. And I also absolutely loved this one. I found this one in a little library, so somebody was getting rid of it. But it's a very interestingly written book because it follows the life of an older woman who has decided to be on a cleaning crew for an aquarium. So she's there at night cleaning up from the day, and it's kind of her putting together some pieces of her life with the relationships that she has with her children, and like, I don't want to give too much of that side of the plot away, but what really like makes this book shine is that some of the chapters are from the perspective of the octopus in the aquarium. So the octopus is making observations about Toba, who's the main character, through what he can see through the glass and what he can tell when he makes his nightly escapes to roam around the aquarium, because apparently octopuses actually do that. They are quite the escape artists. But this was a very sweet and reflective book. But I think that really the thing I enjoyed most about it was the chapters from the octopus's perspective of it was a very different way to see the world and see these characters, so I definitely enjoyed reading those chapters the most. But I would totally recommend this one. This is a very giftable book. I've since had this discussion with a couple other people. where they've said they received this book as a gift, or this is their go-to like gift book for others now. So I would say that it definitely falls in that category. It's kind of a universally appealing book for anyone who likes to read just contemporary fiction. I also recently joined a book club, and after I joined, found out that this is actually supposed to be one of our books for, I believe, December. So I'm already ahead on that, since I finished it right before joining the book club. The next book I read, I listened to as an ebook, not an ebook. I listened to as an audiobook, and of course it's not loading on my screen right now, but generally when I read memoirs, I like listening to the audio version because I want to hear it in the voice of the person who wrote it. So let's see if I can get it to load again. There we go. This was The Opposite of Butterfly Hunting by Evanna Lynch, who, if you don't know, is the actress who played Luna Lovegood in the Harry Potter movies. And I've always loved the character of Luna. She was definitely one of my favorites when I was reading the books and watching the movies, so I really wanted to hear Evanna Lynch's story. However, I knew this book was going to be a really heavy topic, so I waited till after the school year was done to listen to it, or to finish listening to it, because it is very sad. Evanna struggled with an eating disorder for many years, and the book does mostly cover her treatment and recovery. And she says at the very beginning of the book that she's vague on details because she doesn't want it to affect anyone who is dealing with something similar. But there's enough detail that you really empathize with her as the story goes on. And it's not, I will say that it is not just about her doing the Harry Potter movies. That's actually a very small part of the book. But if you want to read an account of someone who has gone through that struggle, I would say it's very accurate without giving too many details away. Very well written, loved hearing it in her voice, but it is a very heavy topic book, but I do recommend it, especially if you're seeking to understand someone who has gone through a treatment for something like that. Next book on my list for June was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This was another physical TBR book, and this is by Heather Fawcett, in case I didn't say that. However, I didn't like it, so I have already passed it on to someone else. It was actually one of my prizes for my book party that I did last month. I put it in one of my raffle baskets. I wouldn't say that it was bad. I would say it wasn't what I was expecting, and therefore I didn't get into it as much. The premise of Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies is that Emily Wilde, the main character, is a scientist of sorts who is studying fairies in the wild in order to try to write a book about them, which is a really cool premise. Initially, my first impressions were like, oh, this is like the Spiderwick Chronicles but for adults. The Spiderwick Chronicles being a children's book series. It very much gave the same vibe. However, to me, there were parts of it that read too much like it was actual academic writing instead of just a narrative story, and that threw me off a bit. It fit very well for the premise of the book, that the main character would write that way since it's from her perspective, but it wasn't something that I could get into as a reader because it felt too dry to me. And that was a very weird juxtaposition in like a fantasy book for it to feel like very dry and academic. So it's not a bad book. I think the plot was still pretty good, but it wasn't one that I felt like I wanted to hang on to or continue reading the series. I believe there's 3 books in the series available now. I just wasn't interested in continuing the storyline. The next book that I read as an ebook, and this was the first one that I read for the book club that I just joined. But we read the book Unseen City, The Majesty of Pigeons, The Discreet Charm of Snails, and Other Wonders of the Urban Wilderness by Nathaniel Johnson. This is what it looked like. And this was the first nonfiction book in a while that I have read very, very quickly. So the story of this book is that Nathaniel Johnson and his daughter used to go for walks through the city where they lived, and his very young daughter would ask questions about what the animals and plants were doing and why things grew a certain way and why did animals do this. So each chapter is about a different organism that they observed in their city. So there's a chapter on pigeons, there's one on snails, there's one on squirrels, even one on ginkgo trees. And he goes through kind of all the information that he collected in order to answer his daughter's questions. So it's a really sweet narration style in that you kind of get this alternating between like very factual scientific information and then kind of sporadically inserted stories about his daughter and why they collected this particular piece of information. So I loved this one, and I kind of struggle to read nonfiction, so it's a big deal when I find one that I really, really enjoy. And I would say that this definitely fit that category. It was adorable. It would be a great, I don't want to say coffee table book, but like a display book. Just because each chapter was so independent of each other that you don't need to read it cover to cover. You could read each chapter when you feel like it. You don't need to read it all in one sitting to understand it. But I highly recommend this, especially if you know anyone who's interested in like city architecture and how it interacts with nature. I really enjoyed this book. All right, up next, my phone has stopped working on the app, but that's okay. The next one was from my physical TBR anyway. This was Sundial by Catriona Ward. And I picked up this book because my husband, who is also in a book club, read a different book by Catriona Ward for his book club. So they read The Last House on Needless Street. So that is actually also in my physical TBR for fall. But when I saw this on the shelf at Half Price Books, I wanted to try a different book by her since I was kind of waiting to read the other one. The other one has actually also been added to my book club's reading list for October, so we're saving it for that. But this was a very like warm weather horror book, which are not super common. But since this one had a desert setting, I added it to my summer TBR. So this story follows a woman named Rob who has 2 children. I'm not seeing the other child's name. I know one daughter's name is Callie. I don't know why I can't remember the other girl's name. Yeah, I don't remember what her other daughter's name is. I know Callie is Annie. Annie and Callie. So Rob, it all starts with Rob noticing some strange behavior in her daughter. And she decides to take her daughter back to where she grew up. I believe it's supposed to be in Arizona on their family land that they called Sundial. So as the book continues, you jump back and forth in time between characters at the present day and characters when Rob was young, interacting with her sister and her family members. This was a very creepy book. Very scary, very atmospheric and eerie, and had a good ending to it. I don't want to give away too much more, but if you're in the mood for something like creepy, atmospheric, and still very like warm weather summery feeling, I would say that this is the closest to a beach read horror book that you could get to. So highly recommend this one. I'm excited to read the other book by this author so that I can check that out as well. All right, up next, also for my physical TBR book, was From Below by Darcy Coates. I've read a couple of Darcy Coates books before. She's kind of an expert in haunted house related horror. So when I saw she had one that actually takes place in a deep sea dive to investigate a wrecked passenger ship, I thought that that was a good like twist from what she normally does. So this follows a dive team who's investigating a sunken ship, kind of similar to the Titanic, that sank with no real reason. It didn't hit anything. It just sank and disappeared. And no one has disturbed the wreck since it went down. So this team of divers decides to go. They're filming a documentary about the wreck, and they start to notice things that aren't quite normal for what an underwater wreck should look like. This one also jumps back and forth in time because you get the story of the ship in its last days before it sank and what the passengers were dealing with. And you also then get the current day story with the dive team and the documentary team. This book was creepy and had me on the edge of my seat. I don't want to give away what the actual scary part of the book is, but I will say it's not just the monsters underwater that make this book scary. It's also the fact that this team is constantly calculating how much air they have left in order to make it back up to the surface. So it's not just the stress of all the spooky things that they're discovering, it's also the stress of some of the characters knowing that they only have a certain amount of air left to get back out of the ship and back to the surface. So it's a very stressful read. It's also pretty long for a horror / thriller book. It's over 400 pages, and usually those tend to be a little bit shorter. But this was amazing. I did make the mistake of having it be my book I read before bed for a couple days, and I would not recommend that in the future. But absolutely loved this one. I will definitely be checking out more of her books soon. Not just the haunted house ones, but some of her other kind of different ones. Up next, I read The Trial of the Sun Queen by Nisha J. Tooley. This was one of the books I left my book swap party with, so it was given to me by a friend. This book, I had some mixed feelings about it. So one thing I've noticed in fantasy in general, especially if you're trying to read adult fantasy, is that the romance aspect of a lot of modern fantasy books steers a little bit too much in the direction of adult romance for me, and not as much on the fantasy aspects. I don't mind if fantasy books have a romance subplot, but I'm not really here for the romance or the spicy parts of the books, as people commonly refer to them. Which is why I struggle to find adult fantasy books that I really enjoy. I don't like that crossover has started to happen, and that it's so hard to find adult fantasy books that are devoid of a romance plot, or at least closed door romances. So if you have any recommendations for clean adult fantasy, I would love to hear those in the comments, as well as any other book recommendations you have or just what you're reading. This is where I felt a little conflicted with this one. I loved the setup of this story. I thought it was very creative. It gave me Hunger Games vibes, along with I don't even know what else to relate it to other than it's a fantasy Hunger Games / The Bachelor situation. It follows a character named Lore who grew up basically in prison because of something that her family members did. She doesn't actually remember what it was. And she finds herself chosen to compete in trials to become the Sun Queen, which means that if she wins, she gets to marry the king. These trials are very dangerous, and she finds herself slowly falling in love with the king as the story goes on. There are, I would say, 1.5 spicy scenes in this book. Both of them did not feel necessary to the plot, so they are easily skippable, almost to the point of where I wonder if they were intended to be there, or if that was your book will be more popular if you include those things. But I did really enjoy the world building here and all the characters. Enough so that I checked out the second one from the library as an ebook, or I think I'm still on hold for it actually. So I do recommend this. But if you are like me and prefer avoiding those more explicit scenes, I just wanted to give a warning that there are one very short one towards the beginning and one also pretty short but a little bit more intense one about maybe half to 3/4 of the way through. But they're not necessary for the storyline, so if you want to skip over them, you totally can. I'm very interested to see what happens in the second book because this one had a really good twist ending to it, and I'm curious to see what happens next. So I gave it 4 stars instead of 5 because of my issue with those particular scenes, but I loved the world building enough that I'm really curious to see what happens next. I think it was very well written. Up next was an audiobook. I'm continuing my Melissa Meyer reread session. So I listened to Gilded by Marissa Meyer, which is a Rumpelstiltskin retelling, mostly because I bought Gilded several years ago, probably close to when it came out. When did it come out? First published in 2021. So I probably purchased it like pretty close to when it was published. Read it, loved it, and then had to wait for the second one. This is just a duology. It's not a whole series. So I got the second one as a physical copy, but because I had really been enjoying listening to Marissa Meyer's books as audiobooks, I decided to get them both on my Audible account as well. So I just finished I listened to Gilded first to kind of give myself a refresher on the story. Still loved it. It's still a 5-star read. This one I would like to give kind of like opposing praise to what I said about this book, in that Marissa Meyer did a really good job in this book of making it a closed door romance. And if you're familiar with the Rumpelstiltskin fairy tale, you know that part of the story is that the main character, who in this case, her name is Cerilda, promises her firstborn child to Rumpelstiltskin in payment for him spinning straw into gold. So you know that someone has to get pregnant at some point as part of the storyline. And she did that in a very seamless way without showing too much of that intimate scene. And I really liked that in comparison to this book. And I think because I read them back to back, that stuck out a little bit more in my mind. But Marissa Meyer in general is a really good example of clean fantasy I would say she's like right on the line between YA and adult books. Like her characters tend to be in the like 19 to 22 range, both for Gilded and for the Lunar Chronicles series. But I really like her as an author, and I'm really excited that now I'm reading the second book in the series, which is called Cursed. The next book was Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. I got this from a little library. I definitely just picked it up because it's been all over Book Talk lately. This one, I was kind of surprised how much I liked it. I definitely picked it up thinking like this is just going to be a quick burn through read. I'm not going to want to like keep it on my shelf. But I ended up really enjoying it. So the premise of the book is that our two main characters, both Emma and Justin, feel like they are cursed. They have noticed that every time they date someone, the person who their ex dates after them ends up finding their soulmate. So every time they break up with someone, that someone, when they go to date a new person, that is the person that they marry and like truly fall in love with. So they meet through a Reddit thread. They decide to go on a few dates with each other to break the curse, thinking that then the next person they'll date will be their soulmate and they will have broken the curse. But obviously, they fall in love with each other, and it's more about them figuring out how to blend their two very unique family situations in a way that will work for them long term. And that was the part that I really enjoyed of this book. It wasn't just about the romance, it was about two people figuring out how to balance their family situations. It was very atmospheric, very summery. Loved all of the setting details. The fact that Emma is a travel nurse, so she kind of lives out of rented properties and ends up renting a house on an island, was like a really neat detail. Yeah, I did not expect to like this book as much as I did. I think this one had one spicy scene in it. Again, easily skippable and not too intense as far as things go. But it makes a little bit more sense in a book like this versus like a fantasy book. Like, that's not what I'm here for. Here I kind of understand. But yeah, really loved this book for the characters and the storyline. I also did not know that it's part of a series, so I will be looking for the other books in this series as well. They're definitely the type where you don't have to read them in order, but the characters kind of all interconnect. So I will definitely be looking for the other books in that series. The next 3 books I read were all very quick reads, but it started because I already had this book, and I'm not going to read the title out loud. I think you can guess what it is. This one is very funny. I've had it for several years. It's basically just examples of really hilariously wrong test answers from kids. So then when I saw the 2 follow-up books at Goodwill, of all places, I had to get them and also reread the first one. So these are like silly, fast read books. I think to read all 3 of them, it maybe took me an hour. But very amusing, very funny, especially if you know anyone who's a teacher or works in education. They're very silly books, and some of the answers are quite hysterical. So those were great, not super long reads. The last book I read this month was another nonfiction, so I managed to get, well, technically it was 5 nonfiction books, but 3 of them were these. But I got multiple nonfiction books in a month, which is really good for me. This one is called When Evil Came to Goodhart, an Up North Michigan cold case. So this was a book I actually borrowed from my grandma's house because she bought this book because it takes place near where we used to have a family vacation home. But it is a cold case from 1968 of a family who was murdered in their Northwoods cabin, and investigating all of the possible theories into who did it. I ended this cold case not sure of who did it. You know how sometimes when you read a cold case and you're like, okay, I know that like because of prosecution and things like that, we don't officially know who did it, but like we know who did it. This one, there were quite a few things that seemed plausible to me, if not a combination of them. So if you like a good true crime case, especially with details about Northern Michigan, would recommend this one. Obviously very sad that it was a whole family that was killed, but the details to this one were very interesting. And I can see why police would have been confused on a final verdict for this one. So definitely a good think about it cold case situation. Those are all the books that I read in June, so quite a lot of reading done. I definitely made a good dent in my physical TBR, so I was really happy with that. And I'm excited to read some more summary books this coming month in July. So it's currently July 8th when I'm filming this. I have lots of like water-related books, mermaid-related books, stuff like that still in my physical pile for summer. So we're going to tackle some of those next. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you're interested in more videos like this or crafty things in general, make sure that you subscribe to my channel. If you want to follow me on other social media sites, that information will be in the description box below. Don't forget to leave me a comment on what you're currently reading. I would love to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.